This is the pre-lab for the vertebrates, lab 31 or lab 29, depending on the edition of the textbook that you have. So what I'm going to do is to go over chordate characteristics, a little review of some anatomical terminology that you'll find in the lab. We'll take a look at the phylogenetic tree of chordates, which is in your lab, and then we'll talk briefly about the anatomy of the frog. So when you come into lab, you'll be doing the hands-on portion, the anatomy portion, and what you'll be turning in at the end, you'll see this loaded into Canvas, will be your lab report. So bring your lab manual to class for the directions, and then you'll also be filling out this report, and this is what I will collect, this handout. So when we look at chordates, that's our large group. Chordates, all chordates have the same or share 4 characteristics. All chordates have a dorsal supporting rod called a notochord. So we see the notochord right here in red. In vertebrates, the notochord becomes our vertebrae, our backbone that gives us support. The second thing that all chordates have, and vertebrates, is a dorsal tubular nerve cord. So the dorsal tubular nerve cord is found here. And what it does usually is develop into the brain and the spinal cord, which compose the central nervous system. We also see pharyngeal pouches. Now, in fish and tadpoles, these pharyngeal pouches become the gills. In humans, they become our auditory tubes, our tonsils, thymus, and parathyroid. Then we also see a postanal tail at the end, beyond the anus. And the tail provides a source of locomotion in fish. And in some terrestrial vertebrates, the tail also provides with balance, courting, and signaling when there's danger. In humans, this postanal tail is vestigial. That means it's reduced in size and non-functioning. Let's now review some terms that you'll see in the lab. So throughout the course in our anatomy section, you're going to see the word dorsal, which usually means the top, ventral, which is the bottom or belly, posterior, the rear, and anterior, the head. So if we look at this diagram again, we say anterior is the front end, posterior is the back end, dorsal is the upper surface or back, and ventral is the undersurface. Medial means it lies close to the midline of the body, and lateral away from the body. However, when we're talking about human anatomy, there's some differences in terms. When we talk about humans, ventral is also referred to as anterior, and that's the front of the body. And dorsal is also referred to as posterior, which is the back of the body. We sometimes will hear superior, the top or cranial, inferior or caudal, the bottom, the feet. We'll still hear medial, close to the midline, and lateral, away from the midline. Sometimes you'll also see the terms in referring to a limb or an appendage as proximal and distal. So proximal is nearest to the trunk and distal is furthest away. Awful lot of things to keep in mind. So what I've loaded into Canvas is this document, Anatomical Terminology by Dr. A. And you'll have this throughout the course as a reference. You see here anatomy. Right now we're going to start with gross anatomy. Later on we'll be looking at slides and histology. And through here you've got, once again, is loaded into Canvas, your directional terms, superior, inferior, anterior, posterior, and then there's also some wonderful diagrams that give you a description and a diagram. So spend a little bit of time to review that, and again, you'll know that that reference is there for you. When you look at your lab, through your pre-lab, you're going to notice that you have this phylogenetic tree of chordates. So we're going to take a couple of minutes to take a look at the phylogenetic tree of chordates. So along this axis, this is deep time, this is furthest back in time, this is most recent. And along this you can see chordates right here. So those 4 characteristics that chordates have, all animals on this have that. From here on up, we see the vertebrates that have the backbone. So everything from here on up has a backbone. Jaws relates from here on up. So all of the organisms, gnathostones, have jaws. Tetrapods, everything from here on up has 4 legs or 4 limbs. And then amniotes up here. Okay, so our ancestral chordate, we go back down here. An example of that would be very similar to the lancelet. And if we notice our 4 characteristics again, the gill slits, the dorsal nerve cord, the tail, and the notochord for our ancestral chordate. So that again includes these 2 groups, the tunicates and the lancelets, which we're not going to spend a lot of time with. And there is your notochord. Vertebrae develop, and so we have our jawless fish. And it's interesting to look at this example of a jawless fish. I have this one here. Lamprey and hagfish are jawless fish. So they lack jaws, fins, and stomachs. So some of them filter feed, they just suck the nutrients out of the water. Others are scavengers. They can actually twist their body to eat the carcass from the inside out. And others have sucking mouth parts, and they can attach to a whale and act as a parasite. So those are our jawless fish. Cartilaginous fish are sharks that have the cartilage skeleton. Up here we see the development of the bony skeleton with the ray-finned fish. The ray-finned fish, things like perch, trout. And we have the lobe-finned fish are worth taking a look at. So our lobed fin fish have lobed fins. And the lobed fin fish are, or at least some type of lobed fin fish, are thought to be a transitional form, or bridge the transitional form to amphibians. So in this transitional form, the lobes of the lobe-fin fish are similar to the limbs of the ancestral amphibians. So if we study their bone structure within here, the radius, the ulna, the humerus, the shoulder, same thing found in the amphibian. Okay, then as we move through the lobe-fin fish, we see the development of lungs. So everything from here on up, the lobe-fin fish actually have lungs too. We have our amphibians, which have 4 limbs. But all of these organisms completely depend on the water to reproduce. When we get up to the reptiles, we see the amniotic egg. So the amniotic egg allows animals to reproduce on land because the amniotic egg contains a shell. Okay, think of the tadpole that you see, or the frog eggs in the water. They're just a jelly-like thing. Well, the amniotic egg, starting with the reptiles, birds, and even some mammals, monotremes, have the amniotic egg. So there's a shell to prevent it from drying out, and then they have some fluid-filled membranes and a yolk sac to provide nourishment, gas exchange, and waste removal for the developing embryo. Our last adaptation is a mammary gland, and that's for mammals. And with this allows a different reproductive strategy. So a little topic I'm going to mention, you might want to keep in mind for your ecology paper, but there's 2 evolutionary strategies. There's R selection, those species that produce many cheap offspring. It's everything down here, lots of eggs, many, many offspring. But with the mammals and the mammary gland, we end up seeing K selections for those species that produce a few expensive offspring and live in stable environments. So the mammary gland nursing the young, mammals have fewer offspring, okay, and than do reptiles, amphibians, the fish. Okay, but those few offspring have a higher percentage chance of survival. Okay, what we need to do now is to take a look at your frog anatomy. So again, bring this to the lab station. Don't forget the first page, the anatomy of the frog, where you look at the external view of the frog. And you're going to notice that the frog has 3 eyelids. They have a nictitating membrane. And that nictitating membrane acts like goggles when the frog swims, and also keeps the eye from drying out when the frog is on land. You're also going to notice the tympanic membrane right here, like the eardrum. When you go through the lab, you'll be answering these questions, but on the paper that I give you, and you'll be exploring the mouth of the frog. A lot of interesting things here. One thing, the tongue attaches at the front end, not in the back, so the tongue can roll out to catch an insect. Okay, Okay, you've got also the volarine teeth that are good at gripping the prey, the internal nares that connect the nostrils to the mouth. So, don't ignore this portion, and then of course you'll be dissecting and opening up the frog. And as you do, you'll be following along in your lab manual, but writing down answers here. For example, what is the function of the tympanium behind each eye? What's the function of the nares? And so on. I look forward to meeting you in lab. Thanks.